Hi, I'm Janlee Siebert. My husband is Audrin, and we moved to Newton almost 5 years ago. One of the main reasons we moved here to Newton is because we had half of our kids here and part of our grandkids. And they are Colin and Andrea Siebert, Mark and Lisa Siebert, and Tracy Chambers. We have other kids in other states. Cecil and Kendra, who live in Clarksville, Tennessee, are there with their little boy Theo, who is 3 months old. Then we have a daughter in Fayette, Missouri, Chris and Amanda. They have 2 children. And then we have our youngest son, Justin and Melanie. They live in Omaha, Nebraska. They were just married. So we were pretty excited about our family, and we're glad we can live around at least most of them. I would like to share my life story, the journey that God has taken me to upon this point of time. Is there really such a thing as normal? There was a lady called Patsy Claremont who was an author, and she said, "Normal is only a setting on your dryer." We all have expectations or a picture in our minds what we think life should look like, how it should turn out, or our circumstances or our outcomes. But we cannot control them, and we get very attached to how we think life should be. I remember a Sunday morning with my first husband and my 5 kids. We were driving to church, and I clearly remember thinking and looking back at my husband and my kids, and I thought, wow, God, you have really blessed me. This is how I think life will be, and I was pretty excited about having such a wonderful family. There are many seasons in life, as we see in the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3. There's a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven. There's the birth, there's the growing up years, there's the college years, there's marriage, family empty nest, and then grandparenting, and even death. Our humanness always guarantees our limitations. It doesn't matter how godly we are. We many times pursue hopes and expectations that are meaningless. But our faith in God alone shows that everything happens according to His purposes. We need to live carefully before God, fearing Him and obeying His word, because He promises to be with us in our journey, no matter where we go. The story I would like to share with you is about my seasons of life, in sorrow, in pain, in joy, and in new beginnings. I want to thank God for His great love for us, for His constant presence with us. And there's nothing in our lives that He doesn't know about. And He has promised to be with us no matter what circumstances we face. Even in the pain and suffering, He has promised to work out everything for our good. I'm asking God right now that He would guide my words as I share my story with you, that He would speak to your heart, and that I would give Him the honor and the glory that He deserves. I grew up in a small town of Henderson, Nebraska. It was around 1,000 people. I was born to Clarence and Gladys Friesen. I was the 4th child born out of 6 children, with 4 sisters and 1 brother. We were raised on a small farm 5 miles southeast of Henderson. My parents were believers, and they were faithful and dedicated in taking all of us to church on Sunday mornings, and we were all involved in the church body. At the age of 9, I accepted Jesus Christ as my personal Savior after a Bible club after school. And along with my best friend, we both became believers at that point. I'm so thankful for my Christian parents who taught us that Jesus was the only way to heaven. I was also involved in a high school Bible club that met once a month and in a monthly Bible study with some other girls. I attended Pensacola Christian College in Pensacola, Florida for 2 years, and there I was challenged to walk with God and grow. While I was attending school in Pensacola, Roger Larson began writing me from Nebraska. He was my older sister's brother-in-law who was back in Nebraska farming with his dad. I was a little confused when I got his letter because I had been keeping in touch with his younger sister. but soon I realized he wanted to pursue a relationship with me. Our relationships continued that first year between Nebraska and Florida, and that summer he proposed to me. I went back to college the second year, engaged and planning a wedding for the following summer. On July 29, 1978, Roger and I were married at my home church in Henderson. We began our life together on a farm near Plainview, Nebraska, which is in north central Nebraska, where he grew up. Ecclesiastes 3:2 says, "There's a time to be born." Our first son was born on May 11, 1980. He came 3 weeks early, and it was a very special day because it was Mother's Day on that day. There, Roger farmed with his dad, and after farming for 2.5 years, he decided to go back to Grace University because his dad was deciding to retire and quit farming, and so we decided to go back to Grace University and get his general Bible degree. We were seeking God's direction for our future, so we went to summer Ecuador in the possibility of wondering, well, maybe God is calling us to the mission field. There he did maintenance for the missionaries for 3 months. And while we were there, we had our firstborn son with us at 2 years of age. As we look back, we didn't feel that God had called us to be there as missionaries, but we are grateful for that beneficial experience to know what another culture is like. Right after Roger graduated from Grace University, Andrea was born on May 17, 1983, in an Omaha hospital. Roger worked on the maintenance staff at Grace University for almost 5 years. We then had the opportunity to move back to my home farm near Henderson, Nebraska, as my dad was retiring from the farm, and they had moved into town. One of our first trials we experienced while on the farm, after we had moved, was on a school morning where our youngest son, Jeremy, was heading to the school bus. It was his first year in kindergarten, and as he went down the driveway, he began to cross the road to get on the bus. And during that time, an older lady who was facing the east bright sun did not see him crossing the road. The car hit him, drove over him, and as a bunch of girls came to the yard and told us what had happened, our hearts panicked. And as we ran, we got to the bus, and we were so grateful to find that he was okay. The wheels had not driven over him, and he had only experienced a broken arm and a cut ear. God certainly had protected him, and he had a purpose for his life. A year later, my husband Roger began having symptoms of weakness and imbalance. After several doctor visits, the neurologist in Lincoln, Nebraska, sent him for a brain scan, and it was discovered that a tumor was growing in his brainstem. It was not considered cancer, and it was slow growing, so they decided that surgery was needed. The doctors were very optimistic, so we had hope, thinking that it would never grow again. He had surgery to move what they could of the brain tumor, and after healing, we believed that God had given us a future of hope. Ecclesiastes tells us there's the time for joy and laughter. We had 2 more daughters, Kendra and Amanda, in 1987 and 1989. Although I had 1 miscarriage, we had good years and kept busy with sideline jobs to continue operating our small farm and raising our 4 children. In 1993, our second son, Justin, was born. 1993, we had a dream of buying the farm, and that was crushed because we had a huge windstorm that year. But God continued to supply our needs. I remember one Sunday morning, we were driving to church, and I remember thinking again how blessed I was with my 5 children and my husband. We had just participated in a 40-day walk through the Bible at our church. And during one of my quiet times with God, I had earnestly prayed that I wanted to know him more intimately. Sometimes my life as a believer just seemed like a routine. It lacked passion and a desire to really spend time with God. Ecclesiastes says there is also a time for pain and sorrow, and a time to weep. The year of 1994 became a very dark tunnel for me. On March 5, our oldest son, Jeremy, died in his sleep. He had had the flu one weekend before, but there were no visual signs of anything wrong the night before. And when he went to bed, I remember kissing him goodnight. It was such a shock. My husband and I tried to resuscitate him after calling 911. An autopsy later revealed a flu-related virus had attacked his heart, which they call myocarditis. It enlarges and slows the heart, eventually stopping while he slept. He was then 13 and a half. He was in the 8th grade, and he was 6'1" at the time of his death. This caused some of the kids at school to really think about where they stood with Jesus and where they would be in eternity. Some made confessions of faith. Jeremy was a kind and a compassionate young man who befriended new kids and raised money to stand against abortion. Weeks before Jeremy's death, my husband had again began experiencing symptoms. After Jeremy's funeral, this time the doctors sent us to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota for further tests and treatments. The tumor had regrown. After doctor's appointments, he was scheduled for surgery, only weeks after our son Jeremy had died. After her surgery, he developed a meningitis infection and was in intensive care for 3 weeks. I was 800 miles away from home and from my other 4 children. Grieving the loss of my son, and my husband was fighting a serious infection in the ICU. But God, he was with me, and he provided a family of someone in our church back home to help me with lodging and help give encouragement. It was a long and a lonely time for me, fearing the possible death of my husband so soon after losing my son. God was with me, and he provided many ways to encourage me and trust his heart. He was caring for me and my family. I was so thankful for my pastor and my family and my church family who brought the kids up to see me several times in Minnesota. After 2 months away from home, we were headed back to Nebraska. Roger was regaining strength and health, and he continued physical therapy and 7 weeks of radiation in Omaha. His parents would meet me in Lincoln at the McDonald's parking lot. They would take Roger with them to Omaha and help them with all his appointments in the radiation treatments. Then we would meet up again at McDonald's on the parking lot in Lincoln, and I would take him home for the weekend. This went on for 7 weeks. By the end of the summer, we were very hopeful that he would beat this and he would live a good life. But by mid-September, he began experiencing difficulty in swallowing, and swelling in the brain had begun. At one point, he was localized hospitally in Henderson and had a respiratory arrest in which he quit breathing. They manually bagged him so he could breathe, and in time it was evident, after calling doctors all over, there was nothing that could be done. I remember being in the waiting room, crying out to God and saying, "You won't let Roger die too, will you, God?" During those days of health-related issues, our church body had spent time praying for him. One Sunday morning, we even spent time on our knees in the sanctuary asking God for his healing. Ecclesiastes also says there's a time to let go and a time to mourn. We said our final goodbyes to Roger as they were bagging him with air. He could only say one word as we talked, and that word was heaven. And he repeated that word 3 times. And because he had struggled at times in his life with the assurance of his salvation, it comforted me so much that he could say, with assurance, the word heaven before he died. He entered his heavenly home 6.5 months after our son, Jeremy. Now it's been 25 years since that season of pain, 8 years as a widow, and a single mom of 4. Philippians 4:17 was a promise that God fulfilled. But my God shall supply all your needs according to his riches and glory. And he did that. He did that in the days when I was overwhelmed with taking care of 4 kids, the maintenance of the house, the yard, when I was lonely, when I was anxious, when I was scared, when I was angry with God. I still knew he was with me. My church body and the community over where I lived in Henderson, they supplied so many needs for me with things I could have never imagined. Food, a new dryer, repairs, bills paid, even a school car for Andrea, prayers and hugs, cards and encouraging notes. In 1998, another trial began with one of my girls. It brought me again to my fears that would I yet lose another child. 2 months were spent in Omaha at the Med Center, and for me spending much time away from home. But God protected, and he brought her home healthy. Again, through family and friends who offered me a place to stay while I was in Omaha, they met my needs, and people met the needs of my children and my family who were staying back in Henderson. Psalm 68:5 says, he became my husband and the father of my children. I clung to him, trying to make sense of it all. I could not find a reason why he would allow all these tragedies in my life. I call this one of my marked moments. I need only to trust him. He gave me hope in Psalms 27:13-14. I am still confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart. Wait for the Lord. Psalm 62:5-8 says, find rest, O my soul, in God alone. My hope comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will not be shaken. Trust in him at all times. Pour out your hearts to him, for he is our refuge. Over the next years, healing came as I reached out to care for others and encourage other women who had also experienced the death in their lives. Barbara Johnson, another Christian author, said, let God use you to help others. It's the best way to heal yourself. 2 Corinthians 1:4 says, God is the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those who are in trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received from God. Another marked moment for me was God showed me that I had a purpose, and that was to serve God and glorify him here on this earth. I didn't have to be a wife to have a purpose. I was his child, and that was all the identity that I needed. Ephesians 2:10 says, for we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God has prepared in advance for us to do. I had to answer these questions for myself. Who is God? He is my Lord. He is my Savior. He is my unchanging rock He is faithful. He is merciful. He is full of grace. He is my strength and my hope. In Lisa Turker's book, It's Not Supposed to Be This Way, she says, "My hope is tied to unchanging promises of God. I hope for the good that I know God will ultimately bring from this, whether the good turns out to match my desire or not. The process will take time, His time, which means long suffering, and we have to journey through before we see God's promises fulfilled." Ephesians 3:20 says, He can do measurably more than we can ask or imagine, according to the power that is at work within us. My season of joy began in 2001, as I had prayed for 8 years that God would bring a godly man into my life, one who would be a good role model for my children and teach them about God's truth. I had other opportunities to date and was quite surprised that they were willing to date somebody with 4 kids. I thank God for the way that He protected me and guided me in this. I had been working at a local grocery store for 5 years, so I got to see and meet people in the community. One morning, I was dropping off a DVD at the local Quick Shop before I went to work. And as I came to the door, I met Audrin. He had come to the grocery store occasionally, and we had talked because during this time, his wife had been struggling with cancer. So my heart was hurting for him. We began talking, and he asked if I had a busy social schedule. He then asked if I would like to go out for dinner sometime. I told him I would have to think about it and let him know. I was cautious because of other dating experiences I had had. I didn't know then, but later Audrin told me he had just prayed the night before he met me at the Quick Shop that God would allow our paths to meet. He also told me that he was a little shook because he did not expect God to answer so quickly. Well, I did call him several days later, and I said, yes, I will go out to dinner with you. The first date we had was in Grand Island, Nebraska, about 35 miles from Henderson. We thought maybe no one would know about us if we went a little further away from home. We really had a wonderful time just sharing our experiences and our lives and our sorrows. But to my surprise, the next day, I went to work. And one of my coworkers had a big grin on her face, and she said, "Did you have a nice weekend?" And I said, yes. And I didn't say any more. And then she said it again. "Did you have a nice weekend?" with a big grin on her face. And I said, yes. What's going on? And she said, "I know about your date because we were in Grand Island and we saw you together in a vehicle at the traffic stoplight." So we laughed. It was not kept hidden, but we had a good time and had a lot of fun with that. But talking about Audrin, his first wife had just 3 months earlier died from cancer, a long 8 years of struggling with cancer. And they knew it was terminal from the beginning. So they had made peace with her death, and he was ready to move on. As Audrin and I communicated, I began to see his heart, one that desired to serve God. His plan was already set to go back to Heston College to become a pastor. Before that, he had farmed for 31 years. So our dating began, and by September, he surprised me with a proposal of marriage on my birthday. My parents, my sister, my kids were all there too. Life was certainly turning a new corner. We dated for a year with travels between Kansas and Nebraska. On June 1, 2002, we were married in Henderson. It was a big transition for my kids. A man in the house after 8 years, and a move to Kansas. Audrin finished his last year of school while the kids attended new schools in Heston. As we approached graduation, he began receiving profiles of the churches around the country looking for a pastor. It then really hit me. I'm going to be a pastor's wife. I felt so inadequate for that role. What was God thinking? I did experience some fear and anxiety about this new role. But we definitely saw God's hand moving as we did a phone interview with a church in Iowa. 3 weeks went by and we heard nothing. In the meantime, a church in Milford, Nebraska, Bethel Community Church, called us, and we began that process with them. We knew in a short time and after a visit that God was leading us to Milford, Nebraska. We had had intentions and expectations of staying in Kansas. So now we had another task of moving to Nebraska after only being in Kansas for a year. As Audrey began his role as a pastor, God began to show me that he had planned this for me long before I even knew about it. And he was faithful to help me see that I just needed to be willing and let him work through me. The people there did not have expectations of me, but they let me be a part of the ministry in ways that I felt God led me to. One of the beautiful times there was Audrey being able to officiate his first wedding, and that was for our kids, Colin and Andrea. We served there for 12 years, and we are so grateful and we praise God for his guidance and his provisions as we serve the people there. God also used both of our sorrowful times that we had experienced to minister to those who were hurting. God used us to minister to a hurting family in the Milford community after their son, who was a classmate of our youngest son in the 8th grade, was killed in a vehicle accident. The parents began coming to our church for a period of time. And as I said earlier, 2 Corinthians talks about the God who's the God of all comforts. He will use our past hurts to help comfort those who are hurting. We were also able to minister to spouses and other people that had died in their life, and even blended families. God brought us to a new chapter in our lives as we believed it was time to retire and to move. We made the decision to come here to Newton, Kansas. It's almost 5 years now that we've been here. We wanted to be closer to half of our kids and most of our grandkids. Has life here been happily ever after? No. Even here, we have experienced trials with our kids, a house fire, the death of our son-in-law, leaving our daughter a single parent, and health issues. Romans 8:26 through 28 says, in the Message, meanwhile, the moment we get tired in waiting, God's Spirit is right alongside us, helping us along. If we don't know how or what to pray, it doesn't matter. He does our praying in and for us, making prayer out of our workless sighs and our aching groans. He knows far better than we know ourselves. He knows our pregnant condition and keeps us present before God. That's why we can be so sure in every detail of our lives that God is working something for good. Shortly after the death of my first husband, someone from my church body sent me a devotional page with this verse on it from Romans 8. At the time, it made me very angry because I couldn't see that any of these hardships I was facing was for good. But over time, I saw God's working and his faithfulness. And yes, I can say with confidence, he will work out things for good in ways we can't imagine in all we face in our life. He is always with us. He loves us. God created each one of us, and if we let him, he will be the author of our story, a story that God has prepared in advance so that it would honor and glorify him. Our journey of pain and hardship that we have experienced in the past or in the midst of it right now can seem never ending, and we grow really weary in trying to be strong and to continually trust God. My journey of single parenting was long and overwhelming, and I struggled at times trusting that God was enough for me, that he could meet my every need, even without a husband. And I continue to this day to be so thankful for the way God continually carried me. He continued to give me his strength, his provisions, and I know without a doubt he will continue to do it because he has proved faithful as he promised. There are at least 100 verses in his word that promises us that he will be with us. In the last weeks, the coronavirus has brought unexpected circumstances and disappointments to our lives. But Lisa Turkis also quotes in her book, in those scenarios, we have to remind ourselves, of the previous experiences of God's faithfulness. Then we can borrow from those times of certainty for today's uncertainty. We can cling to hope that our God who has been faithful before will be faithful again. In Lamentations, he says, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those who hope in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. He is with me. He is with you, and he is the one writing my story, and he will write your story. We can trust him. There are 3 things I want you to think about. Have you ever made plans or been on a journey and things went haywire or crazy? The second one, would you share with someone about a time when you knew without a doubt that God was with you? And the third one, has anyone ever shared with you during your struggles and hardships? What did they say that gave you hope in your trial? Let's point people to Jesus. In conclusion, I would like to share with you a music video entitled, He is With You.